satellite scan. System 1 loaded.
Africa detected.
Satellite coming down in 3, 2, 1.
Rutenina van Kunst in Letterkunde, or shall I also say, greetings in the name of arts and literature. Today we are going to talk about Africa, the second largest continent in the world. It is also the home of the world's longest river Nile and the world's hottest desert, the Sahara. Gruteminse everyone, and welcome to Africa.
$1.2 billion people, or 16% of the world's population, live in Africa. There are over 2,000 languages spoken in the continent. And for the last quick fact, Africa's literature has high literary quality. It consists of a body of work in different languages and various genres, ranging from oral literature to literature written in colonial languages like French, Portuguese, and English. Now, let's get to know more about their flag. This is the flag of the African Union, a political union of 54 African states. The highest decision-making organ is the Assembly of the African Union, made up of all the heads of state or government of member states of the AU. The only African state not included in the AU is Morocco. The flag's features. The African Union flag has broad green horizontal stripe at the top, followed by a narrow band of gold. Broad white stripe bearing the emblem at its center, followed by a narrow gold band and broad green stripe at the bottom. The symbolic significance of each color of the African Union flag. First, the color green symbolizes African hopes and aspiration to unity. Second, the color gold stands for African wealth and a bright future. Third, the color white represents the purity of Africa's desire to have genuine friends throughout the world. National Anthem. The national anthems of Africa are enchanting words of patriotism, poetry, and inspiration. African national anthems praise Africa's history, traditions, and struggles. African national anthems are patriotic songs recognized officially by the African country's official government. All 54 African countries have national anthems. The current national anthems of all nations in Africa were adopted between 1960 and 2012. The national anthems of Africa are an enchanting assortment of patriotism, poetry, and inspiration.
To have a deeper insight into African culture, practices, and beliefs, we use the highlights from the novel Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. First, the African culture. The novel set in the Igbo community represents the culture and traditions that are practiced by different groups in Africa. The traditional practices and the shift to Eurocentric ideals were highlighted in the novel, which only shows the differences in the representation of beliefs when colonialism pervaded tribes and African communities. The novel also gave emphasis on African identity, history, and tradition, which are prominent in post-colonial literature as a means of reclaiming the distinctiveness of African culture. The Igbo culture in their story resembles to many African groups, where polytheistic faith is practiced, hierarchy of inheritance is honored, and belief in superstitions are prevalent. However, the community's practices also shows that African culture has its own judicial system, government, religion, and history which colonists failed to acknowledge and understand. Speaking of colonists, we also have the influence of colonialism. Similar to many post-colonial African literature, Things Fall Apart discusses the aftermath of colonialism in the continent. The changes in lifestyle and practices are highlighted in the novel, which only shows the differences with African customs and Western practices. However, imposition of religion and change in lifestyle are not the only premise of colonial discussions in novels like Things Fall Apart. This story opens discussions about violence, exploitation, and injustices that African communities had to endure in the hands of colonists. Furthermore, the story reclaims African identity, which was stripped when misrepresentation of culture became prominent when colonists started to have control of the tribal practices in the continent. It is also worth noting that before colonizations, African groups are already established and is already rich in history. However, colonizers often looked at these communities with Eurocentric lenses, which led them to believe that African people needs enlightenment to acquire progress. Ideas like this are what post-colonial literary pieces are addressing to remove the narrative that African communities are not progressive. And then there's religion. Tribal groups in Africa often practice polytheistic faith, which saw a drastic change when Western colonizers introduced Christianity. When many European countries have started claiming lands in Africa, including in the Igbo tribe in the novel, Eurocentric religious practice and culture was introduced, which then was imposed to the tribes. Among all of those that changed when colonizers came, it was the religious beliefs that had to endure the threat of change in Igbo society. Lastly, there's gender roles. Prior to colonialism, gender roles have been established in African societies, including the Igbo culture. Due to the diverse cultures present in the continent, there is no specific model for the gender roles imposed in the communities. However, it has always been established that women are subordinate to men in terms of decision-making in family and governing the community. This was reflected in the novel, especially when the main character Okonkwo leans toward macho masculinity. Although nothing much has changed when colonists arrived and introduced the religion and practices in the African tribes. However, the people became more domesticized and had to shift their practices to fit into the Eurocentric ideas that the colonizers introduced.
Guten Abend von Letterkunde. These are the four broad periods of African literature. The first one that we have is oral literature. Oral African literature uses performance, tone, riddles, and proverbs that revolves around mythology and history to entertain the audience. Storytellers use a technique called call and response, in which there is a created interaction between the speaker and the listeners, verbal and nonverbal. On the other hand, the performers dressed as the characters and used props. Sometimes they use the old stories, then integrate them into the new ones, or completely create another one. Aside from performers, the stories then were also delivered through music by what they call griots, or pre-colonial African singers, entertainers, and musicians. Griots perform praise songs with the themes of love, work, children, and mythical heroes. They played a major role in passing the orature in Africa. The next period that we have is the pre-colonial African literature. Pre-colonial African literature is written purely in their native language. During this period, the traditional African folktale called trickster story is getting known. Trickster story is a story where small animals use clever methods to outsmart creatures larger than themselves. Examples of trickster animals include Anansi from Ashanti, tortoise in Yoruba folklore, and sungura in East African folklore. Similarly, in East African folklore, Swahili literature is inspired from Islamic teachings. The popular example of this is Utendi wa Tambuka, or the story of Tambuka. Our next period is the colonial African literature. This period of African literature happened during the Atlantic slave trade between 15th and 19th century. During colonial African literature, Africans began writing in Western languages due to exposure from it. The first African novel in English was published by Ekra Agiman entitled Ethiopia Unbound: Studies in Race Emancipation. Due to positive feedback, African plays written in English were slowly becoming popular as well. The novel Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe is one of the first pieces of African literature to be known worldwide. It tackles how colonialism created an impact on Africa's way of living. As the colonization came to an end, Ghana's 1957 independence from British control and Algeria's 1962 independence from France, African literature during this period began to show themes of liberation, independence, and negritude. The last period of African literature is the post-colonial literature. As the writers began to adapt in Western language, two languages were now used in writing. Experiencing post-independence from the colonial period, the themes of the text were mostly about the relationship between modernity and tradition, Africa's past and present, capitalism and socialism, and most importantly, what it means to be African. Authors such as Chinua Achebe and Ngugi wa Thiong'o included these themes in their work. Aside from these themes, the authors during this period now also touch on social issues happening in Africa, such as corruption and the rights and roles of women. Wole Soyinka was the first post-independence African writer to win the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1986.
Growth of the Von Kunst in literature. Africa has always been one of the great contributors in literature, providing significant literary works that depict culture, history, and language from the ancient times to the present. From the earliest Egyptian writing, the Book of the Dead in the 16th century, the Library of Alexandria being found in 1500 BC, to the printed novels and even TED Talks performed by the writers in sharing how to hone writing skills. Among the African literary contributors are the classic African writers who in their times challenged their status quo, questioned political and social liberality of their respective countries. Among them is Chinua Achebe, whose works include No Longer at Ease in 1960, A Man of the People in 1966, The Trouble with Nigeria in 1984, and the novel Things Fall Apart in 1958 that became an influential novel for the Nigerians and the emerging novelists. He also established an equal opportunity for women along with another classical writer, Wole Soyinka, the first Black American who was awarded the Nobel Prize Award in 1986. A few of his works include The Interpreters in 1965, Season of Anime in 1973, The Chronicles from the Land of the Happiest People on Earth in 2021. Another classic and valiant African writer was Lai, who due to his awakening works about dictatorship went through toils against political powers. His works are The Dark Child in 1953, The Radiance of the King in 1954,
A Dream of Africa.
and The Guardian of the World in 1978. Another classic writer is Christopher Okigbo, who is described as Africa's most lyrical poet of the 20th century. He contributed to the religious, lyrical perspective and literature such as Heaven's Gate in 1962, Limits in 1964, Silences around 1963 to 1965, Distances in 1964, and Path of Thunder in 1968. Another African classic writer is Cyprian Ikwensi. He was considered by many as the father of modern Nigerian literature and was the second Nigerian to gain international acclaim for writing his first novel, People of the City, in 1954. His works also include When Love Whispers in 1947, The Leopard's Claw in 1950, People of the City in 1954, which was revised also in 1969, and Jaguanana in 1961. This novel exposed the corruption within the Nigerian political system. These classical writers contributed to their countries, Africa, and the world by writing new thinking and perspectives that confronts and assess the norms, rules, governance, status, particularly focusing on culture, freedom, and authoritarianism of the leaders. This also influenced the people to voice out and rethink what was happening in the past and what can be done in the present for the future.
Ultimately, Africa is more than just a continent. The countries that make it up have rich cultures, customs, and traditions. There are an estimated 3,000 tribes or groups in Africa, and each of the 16 major tribes have millions of members.
Furthermore, there are over 2,100 languages spoken in Africa. Some estimate over 3,000 languages. Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism are the main religions practiced here. However, many of the people practice traditional African religions.
Also, in African culture, the self is not separated from the world. It is united and intermingled with the natural and social environment. Another thing is, it is through relation with one's community and surroundings that an individual becomes a person of volition whose actions and decisions affect the entire group rather than just oneself.
There is a Xhosa proverb that is common to all African cultures and languages, and this is umuntu ngumuntu ngabuntu, meaning a person is a person through persons. The rich and diverse African culture varies not only from one country to another, but within each country as well. The culture of each ethnic group centers on family and can be found in each group's art, music, and oral literature. And as far as literature is concerned, Africa has a lot to offer, from the well-known writers of the continent to the emerging ones. It preserves the rich culture and traditions of African nations, the myths, trickster tales, which typically explain the creation of the universe, the activities of the gods at the beginning of the creation, and the essence of existence. Their literature also looks back at history that shaped them as today's nations. This is why we often encounter slave narratives, protests against colonization, calls for independence, and of course, African pride, hope for the future, and dissent.